Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. It's great to welcome you all to the Consumer Federation of Australia's webinar on flood insurance and relief and lessons from the UK. For those that don't know me, I'm Gerard Brody. I'm the chair of the Consumers Federation of Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today. For me here in Melbourne, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, but recognise that that's different folk from around the country. And I pay my respects to their culture and to their elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us here on the webinar today. My job is merely to introduce you to our moderator for this evening, which is Julia Davis from the Financial Rights Legal Centre. Julia is the Senior Policy and Communications Officer there, where she's been working to advise and empower consumers in financial stress since 2013. Julia's organisation, the Financial Rights Legal Centre, also runs the Insurance Law Service, which is a national service, provides advice and assistance to people with insurance disputes, and leads a real powerhouse of advocacy around issues to do with insurance and particularly disasters recently. So I will hand over to Julia, who will run the webinar and facilitate the discussion with our guests from the UK and let her introduce them. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Jared. That's great. I'll just start with a tiny bit of housekeeping. This session, I think, is being recorded. Yep. So if you don't want your face recorded, turn your camera off. Although, might I encourage those of you who don't mind having your camera on? It is nice speaking to faces and not to a bunch of black boxes. Oh, God, sorry. My toddler is sick with a fever and keeps trying to barge in. So working from home. Anyway, on we go. So I'd also like to say, please put yourself on mute. Looks like you guys have all done that. Thank you very much. We're all pros. If you have questions, put them in the chat function. There'll be time to ask each speaker questions after each of them speak, and then, you know, maybe a bit at the end, but we've got a lot to cover. I'm just going to do a very quick couple of minutes setting the scene a little bit. As Jared said, I do work at the Financial Rights Legal Centre. We give free legal advice to consumers in financial stress, and we do have a national insurance law service. We talk to about 6,000 insurance consumers every year. I am a lawyer. I answer the phones once in a while, but I also do most of our sort of policy, law reform, advocacy work with one other colleague. And I have to say, I've been really interested in this space around insurance affordability and, you know, a changing climate, mostly because of the people that we talk to. Our clients on the Insurance Law Service are some of the most vulnerable in Australia, and climate change will exacerbate those underlying vulnerabilities, you know, unevenly. So we're trying to help consumers in the changing climate, and it's going to be really hard. And the issues of affordability don't have easy solutions. People on low incomes are impacted by the worst of extreme weather events because they don't have the same financial means to recover or adapt to the changing climate. And on top of that, low-cost housing, including rental properties, tend to be in higher risk areas, and they're built to less resilient standards. There was a report that just came out a few weeks ago in Australia by the Actuaries Institute that found 1 million households in Australia already face extreme levels of insurance stress, and they're going to bear the brunt of future premium hikes driven by climate change. So I found it really interesting that report tried to sort of define what it meant by insurance unaffordability at the intersection of sort of socioeconomic stress and raising premiums. And what they came up with is they defined in the report that 1 in 10 households are spending the largest share of their income on insurance. They currently pay an average of 7.5 weeks pre-tax income on their premiums. And this compares to, on average, about 1 week's income for the rest of the population. So that really shows you the far extreme of who's really struggling with this issue. And the overlap between climate risk and socioeconomic disadvantage means that those most vulnerable people are likely to live in the least resilient housing and in the riskiest parts of Australia. So what can be done, assuming that we want thriving regional communities and we care about protecting vulnerable members of society? We have all seen a number of inquiries and reports that have tried to address insurance affordability in Australia in a changing climate. We've had a Royal Commission, we've had Senate inquiries, there was a 3-year extensive investigation by the ACCC. Any number of academics across our universities are working on this issue. Solutions range from tax reform to better building standards, from government-run insurers and reinsurers to direct subsidies for households, from better public information about climate perils to compulsory relocation of entire towns. I think it's pretty fair to say there's not going to be a silver bullet here. So the aim for today is to sort of, let's take one little piece. Let's look at the UK as a case study. What is the UK doing about insurance affordability for high risk properties? And what lessons could we learn here in Australia that can be applied from the things that they're doing over there? Finally, for those in the audience who are in the community sector, I'd like to challenge you to start thinking about ways that we can get involved in this space at the intersection of insurance affordability and a changing climate, beyond just turning up after a disaster. I know we're really good at that, but this is a big problem. It's going to get bigger. So how can we be involved in new and challenging ways? Let's build some consensus on what we see as the best solutions for our communities and work together to lobby for change. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the people that you're actually here to listen to. So we'll start with Andy Borg. He was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of FloodRe in February 2017. He was previously the CEO of Capita Insurance Services, accountable for multiple businesses, both standalone insurance trading entities and those delivering outsourced insurance and medical solutions. Andy has also held senior leadership roles in high-profile consumer-facing businesses, including BGL Group and Vodafone UK. Andy's here to talk to us about FloodRe. It's a joint initiative between the government and insurers in the UK. Its aim is to make the flood cover part of household insurance policies more affordable. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy to speak, and then we can ask him some questions afterwards.
Well, I was about to say good morning, which is the first mistake. Clearly, I should be saying good afternoon or good evening to the guests in Australia. So thank you, Julia, for the introduction and the opportunity to chat today. I recognise there'll probably be varying levels of understanding about FloodRe, so I'm going to assume none and broadly and quickly explain what FloodRe is, why it came into existence, but perhaps more importantly, what has been achieved and what are some of the challenges that we're facing into now. But perhaps by way of kicking off, I think there's a lot of similarity between the introduction you just gave, Julia, and that disparity, particularly between affordability and that correlation with the most disadvantaged groups that we had in the UK, and to an extent we continue to have. But I'll come back to that perhaps a bit later on, and I'm sure that might prompt some questions, because certainly general cost of living and affordability are phrases that come into virtually every sentence, whether it's in media, in policy, or in government at the moment. So FloodRe, as you rightly say, is a joint initiative between the UK government and the insurance industry since April 2016. And what that joint initiative means is that we are privately owned and managed, and we're regulated in that manner, but we're publicly accountable, both the organisation and me personally, to Parliament. And our purpose is set out in statute, so it's legally driven, has two parts. The first is to promote the availability of affordable home insurance, or the flood element of it, for those living at the highest risk of flooding. And the second is recognising we're actually a time-limited scheme to manage over our lifetime, which is until 2039, a transition in the market such that when we do exit, that home insurance for people at risk of flooding remains affordable. So how do we actually do this? Well, we collect a levy from every home insurer in the UK. They have to pay their share of £135 million sterling. And that's recently reduced from 180 for the first 5 years of our life. They have no option to do that. That's a legal requirement to pay that levy. Then for every policy they write, they have the option to pass the flood element to us at FloodRe. And we don't do any underwriting. We're obliged to take that. And the premium that we charge the insurer is based only on the council tax band of the property. And in the UK, every property has a council tax band, and it's a proxy essentially for house value. So in other words, the premium we're charging the insurer, which in turn will be reflected entirely at their discretion into the premium that the customer pays, has no relation to flood risk. And that's the intent. So the highest flood risk policies are all passed through to FloodRe, and we effectively operate that cross subsidy. So the burden of the few falls on the shoulders of the many. The other important thing to say about how it operates is that the customer experience is completely unchanged. You buy your home insurance in the same way, and behind the scenes, the insurer is determining whether or not to pass the flood element on a commercial basis, a commercial decision, to us at FloodRe. And if you're unfortunate enough to have a flood claim, then that's settled in the same way by your insurer, and only after it's all settled is the insurance paid by us to the insurer. So the customer experience completely unchanged. If I talk about how the scheme has actually been performing, we've actually had 6 years of relatively low flood incidents. We had two very significant storms in February 2020, so just before the pandemic hit, which were the most significant events. But even those were small by comparison with very serious events we had in 2015 and 16, and before that, massive flooding across the country in 2007. As a consequence, we're a not-for-profit, but actually are very profitable at the moment because we have had that low incidence of claims, and that's one of the reasons why we have taken the decision to reduce the value of that levy that we charge to all insurers. And I could talk in lots of detail about all our different commercial metrics because we're a commercially run organisation. But more important is what we've actually achieved in terms of public policy outcomes, which is why we were set up. So a few facts and figures. Before FloodRe went live, if you had had a prior flood claim, only 9% of people could get 2 or more quotes. What we see as of now is that 98% of people can get 10 or more quotes. So it's been completely transformational in terms of availability. But that's only useful if those quotes are actually still affordable. And again, looking at that same comparator for people with prior flood claims, we've seen that 4 out of 5 people have seen a saving of 50% or more on their home insurance. And the excess or the deductible has been capped at £250. And that's often where the flood element was hidden, if I can say that, before, where you might have a relatively affordable home insurance premium, but the excess for flood would run into thousands, or in some cases, tens of thousands of pounds. You're effectively uninsured. And over the life of FloodRe, we've now backed more than 500,000 customers. And in our past year, which closed in March of this year, we were backing over 250,000 within that year. So I would say that FloodRe absolutely has been successful. I'm sure there'll be questions on that. I'll be delighted to take them later on. But perhaps if I turn to the second part of our purpose, which is that managing the transition. So how are we going to safely exit the market in 2039? We've identified 3 things that need to be true, which we affectionately know as the 3 buckets of activity. The first bucket is that flood risk has to be reduced, and that's predominantly a government responsibility. And we were very pleased where the year before last government increased the investment over the 5-year spending plan from previously £2.6 billion to £5.2 billion. So it doubled the investment in flood defences. That's still not enough. And with the rising threat of climate change and with inappropriate development taking place, we know that that investment is going to need to continue to increase. The second bucket is that when flooding does occur, that the costs of putting people back into a safe position are reduced as far as possible. And that's about initiatives like property level flood resilience, either a community level or a property level, putting those local defences in place that either hold the water out or make it faster to recover when flooding does occur. And time correlates really strongly with overall cost, as well, of course, with trauma. And flooding is a horrible emotional event. It's often viewed as, because the news often covers it like this, a massive event that then falls away quickly. Actually, surface water flooding recedes very quickly, but river flooding can remain in homes for days. And the water is not clear like it comes from the tap. It's brown and smelly and horrible, and it's absolutely devastating. And typically, it takes 12 to 15 months before you're back into your family home after a flooding event. Way longer, clearly, than cameras are continuing to cover the flooding situation. And the final of the three buckets is the needs to continue to be an effective market. Now, we at FloodRe help the effective market, but we're doing so with a sticking plaster solution to create that cross-subsidy. And we need to recognise, particularly as we get closer to 2039, that when that sticking plaster is ripped off, that there will be significant challenges if the market hasn't transitioned significantly. So let me give just a couple of examples of the things that we actually do at FloodRe to enable the likelihood of transition. And I should also position this as FloodRe is a small business. There's just about 50 of us. So we are not going to be doing most of these things ourselves. But what we are is an organisation with a disproportionately loud voice, with the ability to connect with the insurance industry as a whole and with government. And we publish every 5 years, and we're required to do so legally, our transition plan, which sets out what we think are the things that need to be true. So some of the things that we've been working on recently, and the one we're probably most proud of, is Build Back Better. So we changed the scheme in April this year, such that if you are unfortunate enough to be flooded, that your insurer, if they participate in the Build Back Better scheme, has the ability to put you back into a better state, a more resilient state against future flooding, up to a total investment of £10,000 than you would have been if you just put back into the same state. So insurance typically works on what's known as an indemnity basis. You just put back into the same state. But against the rising threat of flooding, and we know flood events will become more severe and more frequent, that's just crazy. That's just kind of putting people back into the same state and hoping when the flood happens next time, and it's going to happen more frequently and more severely because of climate change, that somehow magic will happen and the property will be better protected. Build Back Better actually makes concrete efforts to make that home more resilient. The second thing we're doing is identifying opportunities to work with partners to drive up property level flood resilience. That might be raising sockets to a higher level. It might be fitting air brick covers, so when mild flooding occurs, you don't get the water penetration into the ground floor. And there's an area of the south of the country that is having a pilot for these initiatives. We have been working with the Environment Agency and with Middlesex University to measure the effectiveness of these interventions. And that's going to be critical for insurers, such that into the future, they're able to price the benefit for the cost that's associated with putting these initiatives in place. And finally, we are about lobbying and advocating for change, whether that be in planning rules, and we've just had some success in the past 2 weeks in terms of changes to planning rules in the UK, and also the alignment of lending criteria. In the past, often mortgage lenders would lend on the basis that if there was a flood, the insurer would pick it up. But two things are increasingly critical in that decision. FloodRe doesn't cover properties built after 2009, and FloodRe won't exist after 2039. So there are kind of two bookmarks or bookends there that are really critical to being understood. And then finally, Julia, one of the questions I was asked to pick up, and then I'll stop and allow time for questions, is, has FloodRe, by its existence, created more market entrants, more insurers? And the answer is kind of no and yes. So no, we haven't seen a material increase in the number of insurers, but what we have seen is the insurers that were desperate to walk away from this flood risk actually continue to participate in the market. And that availability stat that I quoted, I think, is evidence of that. If you're a flood risk customer and you go onto a price comparison website, your experience will be very, very similar. You'll see row upon row of quotes the same as if you lived without flood risk. And that's because FloodRe behind the scenes is making that possible. So if you reframe the question as, has FloodRe made the market more competitive and more even for living at flood risk? It absolutely has. We've also enabled some brokers and MGAs that work to look at specialist risks, able to operate in a way that they weren't able to before because they just couldn't find insurers to be able to back those specialist risks. So it has operated in that really niche area as well. So in conclusion, I'd say FloodRe has worked. Families that before couldn't get home insurance and lived in homes or indeed communities that were blighted because you couldn't sell your home either, have had some of that pressure removed from them. We can't prevent flooding, but we can be better prepared for it. And that clearly is key. And looking at it through my lens, it's key as we get closer to 2039. We have to adapt now because the threat of climate change isn't just rising, it's rising exponentially at the moment. And I shall pause there, Julia.
Thank you, Andy. Good timing. So please, if you have questions for Andy, put them in the chat. And I'm happy to put them to him, or I guess he'd see them himself, to be honest. I have a few questions because I can't help myself, and I find this really interesting. As you probably know, Australia has put a reinsurer in place only for cyclone risk and just for Northern Australia, but it's got some differences to FloodRe. It doesn't have an insurer levy, and as far as I can tell, it's not going to really act as a voice, as a lobbying org, which sounds like FloodRe is kind of trying to do. So those are some interesting lessons maybe we can take from the UK. But I think one of the things our reinsurer is trying to do is give people extra discounts if they undertake mitigation, personal mitigation on their own homes. And I wonder, does FloodRe do anything to encourage homeowners to undertake flood mitigation works or resilience projects that might reduce their flood risk?
So we don't give any discounts. In fact, one of the things that we did propose to government, and perhaps if I take a step back, FloodRe, that second part of our purpose, the so-called transition objective, was put in place recognizing that at the time, people didn't know what needed to happen to make this possible. So part of our remit was to identify what needs to happen and then advocate for that change. And as such, we're required to review the scheme every 5 years, which is quite unusual to review ourselves and make recommendations to government as to what should happen. So we're continually looking at how to improve. We did make recommendations in our most recent review that we should be permitted to give discounts to incentivize that fitting of property level flood resilience. Government didn't agree. And so we haven't made that change as yet. It's something personally I think there is still a place for, but it's probably secondary to information. So the big thing that we do believe should be mandated, and we are getting some traction on this, is flood performance certificate, so that every property, when you buy, sell or rent a home, has to have a certificate that pulls together the information on your flood risk, the level of adaptation measures that are already in place, and importantly, how you could improve the resilience of your home if you fitted further resilience measures and quantifying those. With that level of information, we think customers will be more likely to price that in, so you start to equalize the home pricing, but also recognize the importance of taking those measures, because we as insurers tend to think of this as, well, does it make economic sense? Flooding isn't about economic sense, it's just horrendous. And lots of people would want, if they're adequately informed, to make those interventions if they can afford to do so. It's very similar to fitting a burglar alarm to protect yourself against burglary, or smoke detectors to protect yourself against fire.
Thank you. That does answer my question. And we might just jump to some of these questions in the chat. I think some quick low-hanging fruit here. Does FloodRe cover coastal inundation or storm surge from, say, a cyclone?
Yep. So all categories of flooding. We have some definitions, as you would expect, but basically all types of flooding, surface water, coastal and river flooding are all covered, yes.
And I wonder, do you know much about bushfire risk? Do you think that the principles that underpin FloodRe could also apply to bushfire risk?
It's fair to say in the UK, bushfire risk isn't a big peril for us, although actually this summer we have seen wildfires both in remote areas and closer to residential homes, and potentially, yes, it could. The principle is that there has to be an identified pool of people that can basically create the levy and the pool from which you then subsidise the few that are at risk. So there are some similarities. Having done some work with California, who have a similar issue, although it's more strongly linked to their electrical distribution, there are some similarities, but there are also quite a lot of challenges. It doesn't map across straight away.
All right, here's a hard one, which I'm sure you get asked all of the time, and that's, if FloodRe has been so successful and it's performing well, why not extend it beyond 2039?
It is a question we get a lot, and the first point is that it's a matter of law. At the moment, FloodRe will end in 2039, and it's quite deliberate to catalyse the action that needs to take place. We can see all sorts of market failures that will occur if we don't continue to invest in flood defences as a government, don't continue to push local property level flood resilience as communities and as homeowners, and don't come up with more innovative solutions as insurers. And having that deadline absolutely focuses the mind. It's not very different to net zero by 2050 or things like that. We are deliberately designed as a temporary solution. So that's the answer on that one. But it's not the first time.
Oh, I'm sure. I feel like it's probably what you get asked the most. Here's another hard one. Really interested in the Build Back Better scheme, but do you think $10,000 is really enough to make a difference to most flood affected houses?
Yes, I do. So £10,000 is, on one hand, you could say it's an arbitrary figure, but the key point about it is that it's a bespoke solution. So it's not just, here's a check for £10,000. It's your insurer working with you and the loss adjuster that's assessing that flood claim. What are the appropriate interventions? So for some homes, it might be a flood door. It's about dealing with a specific point of water entry. For other homes, it might be putting in some sump pumps because it is going to flood, but you just need to move the water out more quickly. For other homes, it might be that it is such a unusual series of events that led to the flooding, so multiple blocked gullies or drains or whatever, that actually it makes no appropriate economic sense to intervene. And there will be some, as you rightly say, where the level of intervention could well be more than £10,000. So it will be better protected. It might not be optimally protected. And that's when you start getting into longer term strategic government type action around, well, if it's that expensive to modify properties, is it sensible to have properties continuing to be located in those areas?
All right, one last question, and then we're going to dive over to Paul. Do you think that there are some properties that are so flood prone that actually relocation, managed retreat is more appropriate than insurance solutions?
Yes, there are. And the big question is how many there are and how do you manage that? And actually there's a strong link here between coastal erosion and flood risk. And in fact, from a environment department, so the government department looking at this in the UK, the strategy to execute these is absolutely as one. So it's flood and coastal erosion risk management that looks at these things together. But there is no doubt that as properties become somewhere between commercially uninsurable or technically completely uninsurable or literally unsafe to be habitable, there has to be an alternative solution for those. One of the things we will be helping with is seeking to quantify that across the UK, which is a piece of work we're just starting with a number of our reinsurer partners.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much, Andy. You've done an excellent job answering all of those questions. Please
Thank
hang around because I think, we'll try and wrap it up at the end and there might be an opportunity for you to say one more thing. But right now, we're going to dive over to Paul Cobbing. Paul was, until June this year, the chief executive of the National Flood Forum, a charity set up by people in England and Wales who had flooded. It supports people who have flooded as well as those at risk of flooding to work effectively with professional partners to reduce their flood risk. It also works on their behalf to champion flood policy and funding issues. This work delivered significant changes in residential property insurance, national flood risk strategy, and a variety of programs and projects. Previously, Paul has worked in the public and private sectors on a wide range of environmental themes, including delivering and developing environmental land management grant schemes, managing public land, practical forestry and ecology. He currently works in a freelance capacity, including on social justice in flooding issues. We've asked him here to talk to us about the National Flood Forum, the work that it's doing, the role it plays in this bigger puzzle of insurance affordability and flood risk in the UK. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to bring this up. Can people see that screen?
Yep, I can.
Wonderful. Good. Good. Right. Oh, my screen's going blank. There we go. Right. Okay. So the start of my journey on this is in 1993, when I paid a visit to Victoria in Australia to look at land care, and came across a lot of farmer-led groups, and in particular, though I didn't really realize it at the time, it was the leadership of some of those community-led organizations that was particularly relevant to the National Flood Forum. So way back in 2011, when I happened to land in the role of Chief Executive of National Flood Forum, I recognized the same approaches that were being adopted in land care and bits of land care in Victoria that were there in the National Flood Forum. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the National Flood Forum. Okay, so the National Flood Forum is a national charity. It's got well in excess of 300 affiliated groups around the country. It's got lots and lots of projects. It was set up in 2002, became a charity in 2007, but it was set up by people at flood risk when they recognized that there wasn't a national organization to represent them. Vast majority of our funding comes from projects. It's not government funded. We have projects with local authorities, water companies and others, and that's how we make things work. So this year is the 20th anniversary of National Flood Forum being set up.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. It looks like your screen is frozen. We're just still on the first slide.
Dear me, I can dip back out a bit. Can you see the screen there?
Yep.
On the
There you go.
values?
Perfect.
I'm going to leave it not on full screen. I'm going to leave it on that because hopefully it'll go through.
Cool.
So National Flood Forum, how does it help people? It helps people prepare for flooding by doing some of the things that Andy talked about, but more particularly by, and we'll talk a bit more about this, about helping people to organize themselves. It helps people recover from flooding, particularly in the long term. You know, the cameras come along when there's a big flood, et cetera, but actually it's minimum of 6 months, often 18 months, often 2 years before people actually feel that they're beginning to get back on the road. And I think we need to dispense with the term recovery, because people don't recover. What they actually do is they stabilize their lives. And that's about as good as it gets. So actually the terminology that we use is not really very, very helpful. We also work in partnership with, or the whole purpose is to work in partnership with organizations, with professional partners. This is not about conflict. This is about finding the best way forward. This is about how do we get to the best places where we can get to. And we also do things and we encourage people along that road. So we help people to work in partnership with their professional organisations in their area. And then we also help people have a voice to government, to the agencies, to organisations like FloodRe and so on. So the National Flood Forum, if you like, is it's a charity that supports communities to tackle the things that matter to them. That's the critical thing, not the things that matter to the National Flood Forum. And it does this by helping people and communities to take more control of their flood risk. So if we go through some of these things, if we support flooded communities, yeah, there are trailers that can go into places all over, a couple of, and that is great. And if we can get the funding, and the critical thing is if we can get the funding, that can stay throughout the whole recovery process, through that up to 18 months, 2 years. And if that really works well, we can then take that forward into action where communities can coherently work together and to work with their partners, but that doesn't happen very often. We also help people through the advice line, much like Julia, you described for yourselves, but for all risk. It might be how do you deal with insurance claim, but equally it might be where do I sleep tonight? How do you deal with the local authority? I have a landlord who doesn't accept that they have responsibilities. How do I deal with that? So on and so forth. We also, during COVID, invented a virtual recovery service whereby National Flood Forum created a virtual hub to which we, with partner organisations, a multi-agency approach. We do this on the ground as well. So the National Flood Forum is, if you like, the triage and organises things. And then as we bring people through the system, we can then pass them to relevant agencies to answer specific questions or deal with specific issues. And that might be housing, it might be insurance, it might be environment agency, it might be the water company, and so on and so forth. We also help people to tackle their flood risk issues. So we support the development of flood action groups and we offer background support to all of those. We develop projects to test new ideas. We'll come on to one or two of those. We develop area networks. This is a new area of work, and a bit like some of the land care stuff that happened in the 90s, where you've got groups of groups coming together to form regional and sub-regional groupings. But the idea is that these groups can then operate on a more strategic level and engage also with the relevant agencies to actually start to address strategic issues coherently. Offer an advice line, again, and we offer blue pages, which is what I'd call bling, flood bling, stuff that you can stick in your house or in your house or whatever to help better protect you from flooding. So we talk a little bit more about flood groups, flood action groups. These are groups around all over the country that come together to, very often they have that community leadership. They will bring the agencies together. We make this assumption in our lives that the professional agencies drive things forward. And sometimes they do. And sometimes they do it really well. But other times, they're not always very good at communicating with each other about something. They often have such broad issues to deal with and such push on such issues that they don't actually bring everything together in one place. Sometimes their particular interests of the organizations mean that they don't really see the whole issue that's in front of them. So if the water companies are really interested in water company issues, but the opportunities lie when they actually talk to each other. The opportunities lie to actually say, well, if you do this, I'll do that. I've understood this bit of the problem, but actually there's another bit of the problem over here. How do we make that work together? So what the flood action groups can do is firstly work with their communities to fully understand what the issues are from a community perspective, but then engage all the agencies together in a multi-agency approach to actually truly work out what the issues are and then develop a plan of action of how to take that forward. So if we just look at this example, this is just a very, very brief summary of the approach. So stage one is all about building that community of practice. and really important. And it's the big failing of agencies is that they go straight to stage 2. If you go straight to stage 2, you can almost guarantee failure unless that community has massive social capital. So you need to go through stage 1 of forming the group. You've got some indicators there. It could be other indicators. The group needs to work with their community to get buy-in from the community to actually fully understand what the issues are for different people, and then to develop a coherent understanding that people accept of what the problems are through articulating the flood risks. And then you need to understand that group and the community at large needs to understand the roles and responsibilities, because they're complex and people assume that Environment Agency or whoever is responsible for everything, and they're not. You know, all the different organizations have different roles, and it is hugely complex. Just from a legal perspective, it's massively complex. So it's important that the group understands where they fit in and what's reasonable to ask, what's reasonable to campaign for, what's reasonable, and where their best opportunities lie. And then the final one is about ability to work with partners. So the group has to agree that they're going to behave in a certain way. And if Joe Bloggs out on White or Mrs. Miggins decides that they're going to be contentious in the middle of a meeting with the agencies are going to get fed up. They're not going to like it. They're not going to come along to too many meetings. These meetings need to be positive, proactive, and really work. So you can then start to engage with the partners. And that process might take 6 months, or it might take 18 months. Okay. Only then can you engage with the partners. And then it's a question of bringing the partners together to actually work in a coherent way, develop some plans, decide what are the priorities, and come up with what you're going to do. So I have one example here from Shifnal, where they, this is an interesting example because we actually costed some of the intervention and the benefits that came out of doing this. And this group formed, did everything I've just told you about, and were offered a grant by the Environment Agency for some PFR, some property flood protection. And after a bit of messing about, they realized that actually the PFR wasn't going to work, and they turned the grant down. Okay, and the reason they decided was because A, the studies hadn't shown which properties were properly at risk. There were a lot more at risk. And B, because they realized that if the benefits being put in, they wouldn't actually protect that many people. They wouldn't actually solve the problem. So they challenged, they turned the grant down, gave the money back, and worked with the partners to better understand what the issues were. And they've come up with some different solutions, some of which are represented on that slide. So effectively what it's saying is for just under 8,000 hours of voluntary contribution, 81 hours of National Flood Forum input, they saved £500,000 of grant. Admittedly, they've now come up with some plans that cost £27 million, but actually the £500,000 wouldn't have delivered the project, wouldn't have delivered the benefits in the first place. But it was only because they had worked in the way that they'd done that they were able to come to that conclusion. And so we get quite a lot of groups that work in this sort of way, but it requires quite a lot of some downsides. I'll just go through the downsides. So this took 5 years of hard work before the benefits started to accrue, i.e. the costs are incurred before the outcomes and outputs can be defined and the benefits materialize. It requires a really active and well-supported flood action group with a good chair, and the agencies need to be able to see and understand the future benefits and be prepared to invest time and effort. And they need to be prepared to be challenged. And it's not an easy ride for the agencies, and it's not an easy ride for the community. So willful individuals, I often use the term willful individuals. It requires willful individuals everywhere to make things happen, and it costs. But on the other hand, in many of those situations, that's the only way that you're going to get the benefits. If you just come in with a scheme that's put in from on high, that then fails, and lots of people complain about projects that then fail or don't, or only partially deliver the results, then this is clearly a much better result. So on the policy side, this little logo is from a project we did with FloodRe. And one of the benefits of that is that it allowed us to go out and talk to communities as groups of communities. And then along with other work that we were doing, let us deliver a whole series of benefits. One of those benefits was that we had a lot of input, and communities had a lot of input into the England flood and coastal erosion risk management strategy, and had an impact. I think it's clear to say. They might not always see it, but they really did have an impact. The second one is we were able to put people in front of Parliament directly. We had special sessions of the Environmental Select Committee. And so communities could talk directly with politicians in Parliament. And that's always great. I'm very happy to go and talk to politicians in Parliament, but I think it's better sometimes if communities get the opportunity to speak directly to it. And our role, or my role as when I was running the National Flood Forum, was to facilitate that and make that happen as much as possible. And then the third thing we were able to do, is sort of pulling all of that together, again with FloodRe's help, was we launched Flood Risk Communities Charter in the Houses of Parliament on Guy Fawkes' night, just before everything came down. That's also been really useful. So those things are really good. The other really big thing was we were very actively involved with helping to set up FloodRe in the first place. And it's been wonderful, actually, for lots and lots of people, lots and lots of households right the way around the country. And so that's great. But like every initiative that you ever have, there are always bits that fall outside the boundaries of that initiative. And that's where I'm focusing at the moment. So on social justice issues, you come across places like this. This photo happens to be taken in Birmingham, but there are lots of other issues. You deal with places where there's previous flooding history, but low engagement, where flood awareness may be low, where relationships can be difficult. There's often limited partner collaboration. Those communities often get consulted to death, and the communities don't see the benefit of that at all. Things just carry on. And the elected members often seem the only route. Okay. But so in this example in Rochdale, we're looking at 46% of people at risk of flooding have no insurance. Okay. And we're just currently looking at why. Because it isn't just about cost. It isn't just about poverty. It is actually things like, have people had a bad experience in trying to get insurance in the past? They've tried and given up. It might be because culturally they have other ways of insuring in that area. It could be that they don't actually know how to get insurance, and so on. So we are looking at that. We've now got a 5-year project just kicked off, which I'm involved with, where we're going to be looking at how do you take a more holistic approach? What's the combination of individual initiatives, working with other NGOs, shaping the planning system, doing the communications thing across the whole area so that people are better understanding their relationship with water. Looking at, for example, getting local insurance representatives involved, brokers and so on, social housing links as well, to see if we can, through a whole combination of measures, either improve people's access to insurance or put in place other measures that will make them more financially resilient, and then improve the context in which they're working. So the planning system, for example, to see if we can take a more holistic approach to dealing with those areas where FloodRe can't work because of, say, poverty or whatever, or currently doesn't work. So that, and we've got being involved, FloodRe is being involved with that project as well. So hopefully that will come out with some positive results. I suspect it's going to come out with some policy requirements as well, because some of this stuff is quite difficult and the barriers are actually around in legislation and the way that policy is delivered, but we don't know yet. And that's going to be a challenge for the next few years to actually see if we can find a way forward. And then it's, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Maybe, yeah, just close your screen if you don't mind, and it just makes it easier for me to see all the questions. That's great. And I know you had your email there, but I'm sure Paul and Andy will be happy for us to share around their contact details at the end of this webinar. So we have some time for questions for Paul. I can see some people have already put them in the chat. One question for you, Paul. Do you ever get any sponsorship from the insurance industry? Seems like you could work in partnership to support consumers.
Yeah, we have had sponsorship from FloodRe, but in individual insurance companies, boy, have we tried hard and never got anything out of it. Never, ever, ever. I did think that was a really good opportunity, but became wiser later on.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting question about, do you ever do anything to assist tenants in particular, not just homeowners?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tenants are a particularly difficult problem. Tenants, because they've got less power in the system and our legal set, there are major things that need to change in our for landlords, in the way we regulate landlords. Private landlords, particularly small private landlords, are a major problem from a policy perspective. Almost, it doesn't matter which policy arena you're in, there's a problem. So we've done some things, particularly tenants packs. We've done, so you deal with estate agents and landlords groups and so on, and we've created tenants packs. You can also create landlords packs. You can negotiate with group landlords, with so on, to try and get the basics in place. We do things like offer lots of advice to people who get thrown out of their homes, or who just told to live in their wet homes. You know, a good example I've got where that photograph was taken. We had flooding in 2018. People who had insurance all got sorted. People without insurance are still living in wet homes. You know, it's just not right. It's just not, you know, and we tried really hard to get the various agencies to come together and do the proper thing. And we still failed on that one. So landlords and tenants issues, it's a big, big problem.
So very vulnerable people that you are dealing with. Here's a question about that. How have you figured out how to reach out to non-English speaking people, or those who are recently arrived in the country? Do you find that they get involved in these action groups, and particularly older people in the communities who might have similar vulnerabilities, like living with a disability? How have you been able to work with them? How do you get them involved? Okay.
So older people are often easier because they've got more time. So if you're looking at typical flood action group, it's you know, they tend to be older. They tend not to be people with families, for example, because people are busy. You know, they're really busy, and it takes someone with a lot of energy and commitment to become involved, unless they've not been flooded. Sometimes what you find is the younger people are actually the people who weren't flooded. They nearly got flooded, and they very often have more commitment. Because they have the time, they have the capacity. People who from different ethnic cultures, sometimes we can put people in who do speak the language, and that's great. But if you've got an area with 27 different languages, for example, that becomes more difficult. So part of that issue then is around finding the groups that are on the ground, finding the people the organizations, informal or otherwise, who are already operating in an area, and then working with them to give them agency, and then helping, and then, if you like, setting up the flood group with their support. And very often we also find that flood group on its own isn't enough if you're dealing with an incident. What you actually want, if you're about to be flooded, the last thing you want to be doing is going out there and stopping the flooding or coming up with relief efforts. You've got enough problems to deal with in your own home. Yeah, to protect your own family, to sort yourself out. What you actually want is somebody else, another set of volunteers, who are able to help you. So very often we get relationships between flood action groups and things like Churches Together or a range of other voluntary groups that in that community who can help, or nearby that community who can participate in that. You get the relationships building up to make all of that work. So it is difficult. The other thing, of course, is people who don't have the social capital, communities that don't have social capital, you then have to go through that stage one in a much more intensive way and in a much longer way to give them the skills, to give them the ability. And maybe they don't even have time to participate. So you have to find other ways of operating, and that can be hard. And it might be those groups are very informal, or you're using a different organization, you're using a mosque or a Sikh temple as a way through or something like that.
Thank you. And just one more question from me, and then we might have to wrap up. Oh, good. Got another question from Annabelle. Sending the list of it. Oh yeah, I'll deal with that, Annabelle. No worries. But one last question from me. I am interested in the interrelationship between the National Flood Forum and FloodRe, and I wonder, Paul, as in your experience dealing with vulnerable people in really high risk areas, do they know about FloodRe? Do they know that it's helping?
Oh, well, this is a really interesting thing, and when we're designing FloodRe, it came up then, and it still is an issue. FloodRe operates in the background, okay? And there's no need for anybody to know about FloodRe. But there is an issue about promoting what FloodRe does. And so FloodRe does do some stuff. And there's a dilemma, both for FloodRe and for National Flood Forum, is the extent to which people need to know and do know. So one of the problems is, say the advice line takes a call from somebody who's been trying to get insurance, and the person on the end of the phone that they've been trying to speak to clearly does not know about FloodRe. You know, and that happens in insurance companies. Not a lot, but it does happen. And so they get into a loop and they're in a bind and they can't get out of that. And you also get lots of drivel from some of the insurance companies who say, oh, you're being charged X because this is part of FloodRe, X additional amount because this is part of FloodRe. But actually, you're all paying for FloodRe. Every single policy is paying for FloodRe. And yes, there is a charge based on the council tax, but it's bringing your policy price down. It's not an additional thing. And so people get a lot of, you know, if you get somebody with the wrong skills working for that insurance company or the broker or whatever, then they come to us and we have to take them through FloodRe. There's also people who want to know about FloodRe. How does this operate? And so actually, Andy's website is pretty good on a really simple explanation. And we have something on the National Flood Forum website too, which takes you through if people want to know. And then there are the other exclusions, again, the boundaries. So some leasehold properties, some properties built after the date now, Andy will remember it, 1st of January 2006, yeah, 2009.
2009.
Yeah. Small businesses, there's already a big problem with small businesses and so on, which are not covered by FloodRe. And so you have to explain what FloodRe is and why they're not covered by it. So again, these are all things that also need solutions. So FloodRe is wonderful, but we've still got to deal with all of these other things. Sorry,
Thank
not
you.
sure I've answered the question.
No, that was helpful for me. Look, thank you so much. We're sort of at our hour, so I might just take this opportunity to wrap things up. Fascinating. Thank you both so much for coming to this. Both sitting in the UK. I love it. International global collaboration. This is how we're going to solve something as existential as climate change. You know, I think in summary, Andy told us a lot about a national program, a reinsurer that is trying to tackle this problem from the top down. It has had success in bringing insurance premiums down. It has had success in bringing insurers back to the table, in giving more options for people who are in flood areas. And it's operating in some interestingly different ways than our reinsurer here in Australia. And I think there's an opportunity there for us to lobby, because our reinsurer is going to be up for review after 3 years. So I think there are some really interesting lessons we can learn. I love the insurer levy. I will certainly be putting that in my submission. But I also think the way that you act as a voice, the way that you act as a bit of a lobbying organization, the way that you're using the lessons you're learning to push for greater change, I think there's a real role for that for the reinsurance org. And right now, I'm not sure they intend to play that role. And then we heard from Paul, who is at the other end, at the grassroots, really trying to empower and enable communities to do this work themselves, as well as giving them assistance and support when they need it. And I don't think there's anything like that in Australia. We really don't have a national charity that is focused on these extreme weather resilience issues, that is focused on supporting communities to build that capacity to try and come up with their own bespoke solutions, and to give them the skills to talk to politicians, to talk to environmental agencies, to think about what are the solutions that are going to work. It will be complicated and it will be different for every community. And some communities in Australia are already facing huge challenges. They're already facing managed retreat solutions. And I think having an organization that could help build that community capacity would just be so powerful in Australia. So I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Paul and from Andy. And thank you again for coming. I'd love to do more of these webinars. So I think if anyone has ideas or wants to get involved, I think it would be really useful for all of us. And I know there's an interesting cross-section of people here right now from ASIC and AFCA and insurers and the community sector, for us to keep learning together, because my goal is for us to come up with some sensible solutions, some consensus, so that we can, lobby for change in an effective way. Here in Australia, we're facing some serious, intense risk when it comes to insurance in a changing climate, and we need some big solutions, as well as, sort of community-driven solutions. So thank you all. Everyone help me to thank Paul and Andy. How do we do that in the Zoom context? Use your emojis. Silence.
Can I just also just finalize tonight by saying thank you to Julia for your moderation, which was wonderful, brought us some real energy and clarity to the discussion. So thank you very much for that. And also a thank you and shout out to Dennis Nelthorpe, whose idea it was to bring this together. It's very valuable for us to do that. And as Julia said, CFA is keen to continue to host webinars where there's interest from the consumer sector to learn. So please be in touch if you've got ideas about how we can help. So thanks everyone for coming along, and good night and good morning to those in the UK.